What's up, everyone, and welcome to Hazenia BJJ. Today, we are with a American pioneer in Jiu-Jitsu, Chris Haueter, 6th-degree black belt. And I think what's really interesting about you, Chris, is you are a man of firsts. You are one of the first Jiu-Jitsu black belts in America. I believe you were the first American to submit a Brazilian in competition.
I
and
was in official competition.
In official competition.
Yes.
And one of the first American to compete at Mundials in Brazil, correct?
I was the first black belt to compete in Mundials. We brought in a team of there's a bunch of other lower belts that came during that trip.
Mm-hmm.
Illinois, a lot of guys.
What I think is really interesting about your story and kind of the first Americans in Jiu-Jitsu is you got into Jiu-Jitsu before the first UFC.
Yes.
And yeah, for me,
go ahead.
I was going to say, for me, this kind of blows my mind because when you talk to people who know nothing about martial arts, who don't know anything about Jiu-Jitsu, and you show them Jiu-Jitsu, they're like, what is this? This is so weird. It's like two dudes on the ground hugging each other. And so for me, at least I have the reference of UFC. That's how I got into Jiu-Jitsu. I knew UFC through that. I was like, oh, okay, I had an idea of it. But for yourself, you didn't have that reference.
Obviously history, and once a culture grabs a hold of something, it alters everyone's perception about it. And I often say, like, I remember a time in the late 90s where all of a sudden kids and adults intuitively knew what a rear naked choke was and an arm bar, even before they'd ever trained, because of the video games, because of it was in the zeitgeist. And before UFC, like, I remember a time where I was a purple belt. I was probably the highest ranked guy in the 3-state area in the South. And I was in a special operations unit, not an operator, but I could line up everybody, say, put down $20, and in a minute, I would submit all of them because they would stick out arms and necks. And I remember when this shift happened where even the white belt untrained somehow just knew, don't extend your arm or it gets locked. It was a period where what I call the first jiu-jitsu wave had definitely gone global. And that was a couple of years after UFC, and when I was a new black belt. And it was it was a bittersweet thing. It's like, I remember watching Royce win UFC 1, and obviously being happy. He was my first a coach in the early days, doing in Horion's garage with privates. But at the same time, I was honestly a little sad because I knew now the cat's out of the bag. And I knew that I was so lucky to be in the place where I was, to happen to have stumbled upon the greatest martial art ever, hidden in a garage where you could not talk people into doing it. They thought it looked weird, putting another man between your legs, the whole thing. And I struck gold. And all of us in those early garage era, we knew that what we had, I often say, it was like we had AR-15s and everybody else had a musket. And as long as we didn't get shot with that first shot, we're going to win the fight. It was the most predictable outcome. And as most martial artists know, martial arts is in essence an attempt to make order out of the chaos of a hand-to-hand combat, and to override or to rewire our instincts, which are to windmill punch, close your eyes, freak out, grab, get really tense, and all that. And here was this wonderful martial art. And as a guy who'd been, I'd already had one pro Muay Thai fight. I was a high school wrestler. Like, I was exposed to the reality of combat sports, and I could not believe how awesome jiu-jitsu was. Just could not believe it.
When you first came across jiu-jitsu, and was it in Orion's garage, right?
In Orion's garage, yes.
like, was it an easy sell for you? Were you like immediately, yeah, like this is gonna work, or did it take some like practice for
Well,
you to be like,
the short version of it was I was a couple months after my one and only pro Muay Thai fight, which I won, but it hurt really bad. And during this period of time, I was really into boxing too. I was a high school wrestler out of high school, all that. And I realized why boxing is a sport for the poor. And I mean that with all respect. People who go become pro boxers, you have to take a lot of shots to the head. And you have to want it really bad. And it almost has to be a way off the street. And I didn't come from that world. I came from middle class suburbia, and I didn't like getting hit in the head all the time. I loved the art, but I didn't like being punched in the face. I often say I love the art of boxing, but it doesn't love me back. And so I was going to the college to join the wrestling team because I was a natural grappler anyways. It was like 2 or 3 years out of high school. And the Aikido club was happening before wrestling practice, and I knew the guy who ran it, and I saw them practicing mount escapes, which back then looked utterly weird, especially as a wrestler. It looked like something the way grade school kids would fight. And I remember mounting a guy once in school, but it's not something wrestlers did. We pinned you in head and arm moves and all that. And I was asked, I'm like, Mitz, I don't think this will work against a good wrestler, not even against me. And he said, well, let's try it. And of course, I got choked, tapped, I exposed my back and all that stuff. And I was like, I couldn't believe Aikido had this whole ground thing. And he said, this isn't Aikido. It's a special jiu-jitsu. And I'm technically not even allowed to show you this. So don't say I did. And here's the guy's number if you want to learn. And he wrote down Horian's number. I immediately called. And within a week, I was sold before I walked into Horian's garage. I intuitively and instantly could tell that these white belts in the jiu-jitsu had out-knowledged me, out-technologically beat me as a wrestler who was a fighter. It just blew my mind.
What were the first days of training like in the garage? Like, were there other Americans? Were you the only American?
There were other, yes. And like I was somewhere, like I want to say somewhere between the 5th and 8th American black belt, but I certainly was not the first American. Richard but Bresler, there were other guys there, but Bob Bass. And it was God, it was cool. It was like we had discovered this amazing thing, and we would convince just our friends but to join. And back then, all martial arts, but in particular but jiu-jitsu, this is all pre-internet, and it was all during a period of time where martial arts were viewed as these either totally fake things or this magic, that like this inner magic where if you learned the inner art, you'd be able to dim mock a guy and all that. It was, and the combat sports were not even considered to be martial arts. In other words, like judo seemed weak then. I don't know why. Maybe because I was a wrestler Muay Thai guy. Taekwondo was a game of tag with your hands and feet. Muay Thai was real, but it was a solid sport that hurt really bad. And here was this thing with jiu-jitsu that encompassed all of the magic that the fake martial arts had, but it was real. That was like the feeling I had as a kid who'd done martial arts his whole life, from karate to kung fu club to boxing to wrestling. Like I had just found this absolute pinnacle of magic. And as an amateur anthropologist, a lot of times I was fascinated, like, how did this develop? Because I know no one invented it. I knew it was a course. And I firmly believe that environment is stronger than will, especially in populations. And I used to say, like, when I was just starting to run around and instruct, except I have these sayings and then I get sick of my own words, that what we are practicing is of Japanese origin, Brazilian modified, highly modified, and American influenced. That was the late 90s, what we were doing. It was, and in what I firmly believe is that in Japan, and there's always problems with any extreme, either extreme liberalism, extreme conservatism, extreme progressivism. Japan's martial art were very hierarchical, controlled environment, extreme, conservatively curated. So that stops growth, but it preserves something. If you don't want to lose an art, you need that. You need that conservative institution to preserve an art. And in order to grow an art, you need that liberal part of trying new stuff and experimenting. And I firmly believe that in Brazil, after the war, when the Japanese were fighting to preserve the art and jiu-jitsu evolved into the controlled sport of judo, Brazilians were removing the rules. The Japanese were adding rules, Brazilians were removing them, and orienting the fight much more towards the honor culture duel, because the culture is very much a male patriarchal honor culture, and when men don't agree, they duel. And all cultures, of course, throughout history have honor culture, and periods of time in which it is perfectly respectable, as a matter of fact, culturally demanded, that if your honor is violated, that you duel. And in such a culture, you're gonna learn how to fight. Whereas a culture where that's gone, you're gonna lose that aspect. And in Brazil, with Vale Batuto and the challenges, this art, the environment changed in a way where it forced it to evolve. And going back, my brain's always scrambled, but what amazed me was what a beautiful, flowing, efficient art came out of the contrast, which was a much more aggressive, stubborn, unopen-minded way. It was almost like the perfect yin-yang. And so this art over a period of 20 years rapidly evolved. And the 90s were this period, what I call the Cambrian explosion, where globalization was off the hook. And so you had sambo culture, judo culture, wrestling culture, but jiu-jitsu, all of these things were meeting. And like everything, you evolve to take what works and you remove what won't work. And because of the lack of rules, it allowed these laboratories to experiment. And because of the connectedness of the world, it allowed this knowledge to not get lost and be transmitted from person to person, from purple belt to showing a blue belt, from going to the Machado mat and there's 8 sleeping bags in the morning and there's a bunch of guys from Rio showing me all the cool newest stuff. And it was just this amazing time. Boy, I can ramble, huh?
No, that's great. It's interesting, like, you talk about how in Brazil they had this culture, like the Brazilians really wanted to prove that jiu-jitsu was the best martial art. So they did their challenges, they went and fought on the beaches, they fought the other martial arts, they fought the other Brazilian jiu-jitsu schools. And that was really like kind of their motivation behind developing their jiu-jitsu, was to show that it is the best, our school is the best, it's practical,
Absolutely.
it's real.
Absolutely.
When it gets to America and you're training there, what is the motivation with yourself, with the other Americans? Like, are you in a similar kind of mindset where there are American challenge matches where you're going off the Taekwondo schools?
Yeah, I mean, there were. I had a few challenge matches as a purple belt. That's a whole long little story when I'm in Florida, and obviously my coaches and mentors are all in LA, and I had to keep the honor because I'm instructing this little club, and the karate school instructor challenged me, one of the kung fu guys, and too bad none of them were recorded on VHS, but like that was like, I'm sure if it happened in the era of the iPhone, I would have recordings of it. Almost all of my matches and those early matches weren't recorded. And there's also a thing where, as people were trying to record, a lot of the culture did not want it recorded, because that's how knowledge escapes. And it was much more like you keep your secret knowledge. You don't, like, one of the rules I learned very early on is, if they don't ask, you don't tell. In other words, when I would go to the judo club in Alabama, when because I'm jonesing and I got a roll, and I would slaughter these guys, they would never ask me how I did it. They just assumed I was good at ground with judo, and they would be frustrated. Sometimes I remember this one, the black belt was so mad. I thought him and I were almost about to really fight. Like, he pounded the mat after I would throw a guard and armbar. It just infuriated him, but he didn't ask. And so it was kind of a thing. I used to have a joke, is like, oh, who you, Chris Haueter? You want to hear? Are you here to fight? No, I'm here to be a student. Okay, my friend. It was like all honor culture, you yield and you get let in, and then you become part of the game in the hierarchy. Or your ego's too big. You say, fuck that, I ain't gonna fucking kiss no Brazilian fucking family's butt over this thing. And there were a lot of those guys who created like the early American MMA camps were really anti-Brazilian camps. And there was a period of time where I felt a little guilty, because I'm this open-minded American guy who came from the Jeet Kune Do mindset world, whereas, which I often say now, in an age of looming thermonuclear war, AI, political unrest everywhere, whether I show you my armbar trick or not is like the littlest worry I have, right? So, but I would go train early UFC guys, the jiu-jitsu. Like, sometimes I train Randy Couture and other guys, because they were so inexperienced and unknowledgeable at, especially the guard, in the same way that the Brazilians didn't really understand the Greco-Roman wrestling. And again, it was this period of time where a lot of the jiu-jitsu we do right now, there are pieces of it, knowledgeable, huge chunks that come from other arts, that don't come from the original Japanese jiu-jitsu. And yeah, I've rambled along and kind of lost my train of thought there.
No, I have so many thoughts about the things you said there. One of the things that, like, I think that's recently emerged is we're kind of seeing, I don't know what you want to call it, like a rivalry, a tension between Brazilians practicing jiu-jitsu and Americans practicing jiu-jitsu. We have this whole thing of like, yes, AJJ versus BJJ. Was
Yes.
this something that was like still happening like when you were training jiu-jitsu? Was there like, these are the Americans, we're not going to show them everything? Or were you guys on friendly terms, like, let's grow the sport, let's get this worldwide?
It was both. I mean, obviously, like my coaches, my mentors, and still currently, the Machados, Hicks and Gracie, like these guys were open-minded and doing everything they could to make their guys top-notch grapplers. But there was definitely people who, you just get the sense that they're here to figure out what we know so they could beat us, not join us, right? And there was a lot more of that happening, and certainly in the early days, and it is as well. Jiu-jitsu is very tribal, almost like organized crime tribal, and that's a whole other topic. But and it was a fascinating culture, and it still is. And I kind of see it's almost like now. So like the 90s was also a period in which the Brazilian main founders, to include Carlos and Helio, could no longer control how the art was being practiced. There was too many black belts now in Brazil doing their own thing and going every night into the laboratory and figuring out other ways to accomplish the same goal, which is to control and submit your opponent, utilizing the least amount of athletics and attributes and the maximum amount of knowledge, leverage, cunningness, and guile. That's the art. And the sport, as it grew, was how do I deploy my art within the man-made rules of the game, utilizing all my athletics. So you have this other yin and yang split. You have a very athletic sport style growing, and you have a much more research development art style happening. Then you have the third wheel, which is the self-defense. We're orienting everything towards a gladiator pit fight to the death. And that's how I organize, how I instruct, is I maintain that balance, because each of those has strength and each of them have a weakness. There's like, I often say that like when you compare judo, modern sport judo and modern sport, the jiu-jitsu is like comparing a panther and a cheetah. They have the original ancestral cat roots, but one of them has clearly evolved to hunt on the plains of Africa with a fast sprint and a few quick turns, and the other has evolved to maneuver through the vines in a jungle. And if you put the panther in the plains, it starves. If you put the cheetah in the jungle, it starves. But its ancestral root, somewhere back there, millions, tens of millions of years back, is the same cat that gave rise to every cat out there, and the lion and the tiger. And the modern sport gi game is often like trying to interbreed a lion and a tiger, because yes, you got to learn throws and all that stuff, but you're not as rewarded as much, which and nor are you punished if you pull guard. Therefore, the environment changed, so the art changes. And in those early days, a lot of the more Vale Tudo-oriented people hated how the sport was killing what they said was the Vale Tudo aspect of the art. They didn't like that, because as soon as I can't hit you anymore, you're going to grapple a whole other style. You'll be less hand aware. You'll be able to do all these spinny inversion moves and all this, which I also love. But that's the same thing, is because you remove some of these things, it allows the art to evolve in a way that it never would have if you always included striking. Then when you perfect these grappling only moves, suddenly you reintroduce them, which is how evolution works, and you create a hybrid and ultimately a better species.
Mm-hmm. I have to ask now that you've like given that kind of like analogy of like the cats and like the
Yes.
jungle and the plains. Where do you sit on this modern debate of American Jiu Jitsu versus Brazilian Jiu Jitsu? Do you see them as fundamentally different?
Well, what Hickson told me just the other month was something to the effect of, I don't even call it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu anymore or American, it's just Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah.
And it's almost like once we bring in who owns it and what we're going to name it, nomenclature in anything, especially in academia, can both clarify what we do and obscure what is. Like in the life sciences, much of what you initially learn is just nomenclature. Learning all the names of the bones, all the names of the muscles, all the names of the organs, all the parts of organelles, all the parts of the cell. And is that really understanding it? A little bit, but really you're just naming shit. But our brains need to categorize as pattern recognition machines in order to find the patterns. And that's where you're finding, oh, life is the patterns. It's not the names of these things. And just because I can come up with a more precise Latin name for this illness, that sounds like now I understand what the illness is. Really, I'm just saying in Latin, he has sore elbow, sore stomach. And so we go back and then realize that understanding anything requires something beyond nomenclature and cultural ownership. And 1 + 1 = 2, whether I speak Japanese, English, or French. And so in some ways, we're looking for the objectivity, whether I'm going to say that evolved in Brazil or America, or which country is evolving it better, is kind of irrelevant from my artist, science, historian point of view. I think it's fascinating, but I don't engage in those nationalism debates.
Yeah, in the practical sense, jiu-jitsu is jiu-jitsu. It doesn't matter if you learn the move from an American or from a Brazilian. Can I do it in sport jiu-jitsu? Can I do it in self-defense? That's what really matters.
Yes. I used to say this all of the time, and here's my American pride, yay, wag the flag, is if jiu-jitsu becomes a high school and college sport, within 4 years, Americans will rule the podium. You'll do wrestling season, it will end. You'll start jiu-jitsu season, you'll get your college scholarship. Within 4 years, if it becomes this Olympic sport, it will rule it. And the Brazilian organizations are the ones that have prevented it from becoming an Olympic sport, because then you're surrendering ownership. And when there won't be an Olympic blue belt world champion. There's only black belt. All the lower belts are practice to get to a black belt where it fucking matters. Adult division black belt. That's what matters. Not seniors 5. Yeah, I've won those. Whatever. What matters is the adult division black belt. And should this become an Olympic sport, then all those others, it will be very clear that's all practice. And that sandbagging becomes stupid. Trying to get team points is stupid. And the one thing that Americans, and the English for that matter, and some other places, I don't want to only say America does this, is we do a really good job at academia. And I know everybody's mad at academia these days for all kinds of fucking reasons, but there are multiple PhDs out there who are scientifically figuring out what's the most efficient way to cut weight, what is the optimal weight class for your body type. And that's like, that's something we do very well, and work as a team to get individuals to win in that sport. When I was in high school wrestling, it wasn't uncommon that we would go train once a week with our rival school, rolling with the guys that we are going to compete against. That was unheard of in jiu-jitsu, karate, taekwondo, in the more structured hierarchical arts. It was just absolutely unheard of. And the Americans have changed that. Like the Americans created open mats. I ran and started the first women's class that wasn't self-defense, but women's jiu-jitsu, because I wanted to meet girls. And I was a brown belt, and there was a couple of girls who trained women's, I should say, women's is. Oh, Chris, you want to start a women's class? Ah, I know what you're doing, you smart guy. Okay. Okay, nobody trains on Sundays. You can have that time slot. And eventually I gave that class to Leka, who was one of the first female black belt world champions, and Cindy Omatsu and Chris Shaw, and they like took that women's class. But I really genuinely did start the first sport women's class for non-altruistic reasons.
Okay, now I have so many questions. So when you were training, open mats were not common because I guess there was like you said, like they don't ask, you don't tell.
That's right.
We're not going to let them come to our gym and
Yes.
learn our techniques for free kind of thing.
And each gym definitely had their own style. There was Haueter style guys who were closer to the Jean-Jacques style guys. The Hegan style guys were more pressure oriented. The Hickson guys were more Valley Tudo oriented. It's like everybody definitely had distinct styles, each academy, and each grappler ultimately.
How did that conversation go when you said, I guess you were with Hegan, right? When you said, hey, I want to do an open mat. Was he like, no, or did you have to like fight and convince them to do it?
Well, one thing that I learned, and I learned this, I think I learned this in the Marine Corps, and I think I learned it by overhearing someone. If you want to get something done, you make them think it's their idea. And then they'll be all into it.
Nice.
But if you present people, say, I've got the better idea, you just butt heads. Yeah. But if you say, hey, remember when you said it would be really cool if I flew over to England and instructed with Dan Inosanto? And then there'll be a pause and say, yeah, I remember. Well, I've been asked, can I go? Yeah, that's a great idea. And that was more how I learned leadership from behind 101.
Being the neck that turns the head.
Yeah.
Okay, now I got to ask about the women's class.
Yes.
Again, like there's no UFC. I can't imagine there's that many women who are into wrestling in like the 80s and 90s. How did you market this?
Well, okay. When I started that class with the help of Cindy Omatsu, who was a new purple belt, I want to say this was the time around UFC 3 or 4. So it was out.
Okay.
And her and I, she got a couple of her friends, and really within about 2 weeks, we had a minimum of 6 women's on the mat. And yeah, it was pretty cool.
So and did it work? Did you get any phone numbers?
Oh yeah. And I did, the stupid stuff that young males always do, and lost some students because of it. And yeah, I mean, I screwed up, and yeah, eventually the women took over the women's class, which is how it should be. And also, I remember what had happened was all of a sudden, a lot of the guys realized that I'm meeting all these women Sunday morning and they're not. They're like, what the fuck? Chris Haueter has a harem? I'm coming. Let me come. We'll just roll on the side. And yeah, it was, there was all kinds of conflict.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
That's really cool though, because now like it feels like women's class, every gym has to have it. Otherwise, like they're missing something. So
but now I will also say that it was inevitable. Somebody was going to start it.
Yeah.
And, you know, my wife is a very good black belt, and she, in many ways, is a better instructor than I am, especially when it comes to foundational sport-oriented jiu-jitsu. Was a competitor and has a very good overall jiu-jitsu, and especially oriented for people who are going to need to have certain skills that you need, obviously for the street, but also if you ever want to compete.
Yeah, for sure. Following up on like kind of like traditions that have started, like I said before, we did this kind of Instagram series where we talked about, you know, jiu-jitsu traditions such as like Shark Tank, such as the belt gauntlet, slap pump. You had a few comments on a few of them, and I wanted to ask you about them. So when we first posted the video about the belt gauntlet, a lot of people were surprised to hear that you started it in America. They all thought it was like from Brazil, 100% Brazilian. Can you tell me what was going through your mind when you started this?
Well, I will just say this. It is possible that maybe simultaneously a Brazilian started it as well. Sure. But honestly, I don't think so. And that kind of started during this period where I'm a new black belt. There's like me, Bob Bass, Joey Bass, Dave Myers, a couple of other of us were running the academy while the Machado brothers were filming a movie. That movie they made, you can watch it on the internet. It's actually a cult classic. It's so bad, it's brilliant. And we were running the academy, and somehow it was like part of it came from like I was recently out of the reserves, and there's certain rituals in hazing that the military does, and we were promoting a couple blue belts, and it just almost came on a whim. Like, how about we whip them? And the first couple of them were really bad because we were experimenting. Like, people were doing multiple whips, and it's like, whoa, no. Oh, you do one walk, everybody gets one hit, and then people got hit in the face. It's like, okay, wrap your gi around your head. And it's all stuff that, like I say, I'm not proud of that. I don't think hazing is really good. I think it's a far more abusive way to promote. I don't think it's a great recruitment tool.
Yeah. It's a bit of a rough sell if someone walks into the gym right in that moment.
In your family-oriented school. I mean, back then, there weren't the kids' classes. It was kind of a thing where if you want to know if a martial art is quote-unquote real, you watch the adult classes. And if they only have kids' classes, it's fake. It's some bullshit. Hi-ya, hi-ya, hi-ya. And then you watch the adult class, and they might have a couple guys who are real, and then maybe you challenge them or you recruit them as a student. Like that was still like the tail end of that era. And jiu-jitsu schools were far more rough-oriented, I would say, back then. Not like the family-friendly school. Like Horion's vision was definitely more of a money maker than the guys who were there to compete and or do MMA. And Henner and Huron like clearly have figured out how, and they have the perfect family-oriented school. And most schools now, if you want to earn a living at this, you have to be a family-oriented school. Even if you are the 5-time IBJJF world champion, if you can't coach, you can't instruct, and you can't recruit a broad spectrum of non-athletes and athletes, you're going to struggle. And I often say as well, like for the last 30 years and specifically the last 15, like I do a lot of seminars and book clinics all over America and all over the world. I can almost tell right away if this school is going to be successful or not, because of I've seen all the ways that don't work. I've seen how one or two thuggish guys can poison a school and get people to quit, where the instructor has no idea. Well, why are my members? Because they don't want to come up and go, you know, that one guy's really slimy and gross, and he changes his clothes right near the women's room, or like whatever it is, right? There's all those little things that good leadership in an academy is critical. And some of my black belts, I am envious of how successful they are because they've done it right. They've really curated how to keep it real and at the same time get people to want to stay in the school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah.
So when you found out that maybe, you know, the belt gauntlet wasn't working out, was that when you transitioned to like the Ironman, to the Shark Tanks?
The reason why I went Ironman, so in high school wrestling.
Can you explain what the Ironman is for people?
Yes. So in wrestling, what our coach would call the Ironman is everyone's in the hot wrestling room and everybody runs. And in the middle, there's a match. And whoever keeps winning gets to stay there until they lose. You beat them, you take that spot. And usually it ends up, it's the most senior heavyweight who's obviously holding top all the time. So when I would teach my jiu-jitsu class, I would just like, and I learned this from the Machados, is you might have, okay, the 3 guys out there, your guards, once your guard is passed, you're out. And if you could like hold your guard, sub a guy, sweep them, then they're out. And it's a fun game. And so when I was instructing up in Oregon at BG, one of my guys who was a really tough blue belt was ready for his purple belt. And previously, when I would teach privates, I used to love rolling with the guy, wearing them out like, oh, I got to stop. No, you can't stop until I tap. Making them have to sub me, which is a like mental game, right? And as a coach, that's how you build your guys. When they are not allowed to quit until the fight is over. And eventually they would sub me and I'd go, great. But then I realized, like one of my more older clients, like I wore him out, removed his white belt, got the blue belt and snuck it around him, tied it, and he didn't even realize until like he's exhausted. He almost wants to cry. Like, I can't believe you pushed me. And then looks down and realizes, wow, I'm a blue belt. And it's like, you earned it. So then that became my way to promote, especially upper belts. I couldn't wear them out alone. So I would Ironman them first. And when I saw they were sufficiently exhausted, then I jump in, wear them completely out, get on their back or wherever and wrap a belt around them. And then everybody claps and they look down and realize, oh my God, I got my purple belt or brown belt. And then BG really liked that, and they made it an institution where I didn't. I'm just like, I'm one of those guys, like, one year I'm promoting guys this way, one year I'm doing it that way. I was more all over the map.
That became their tradition that they do.
That became theirs, yep. Yeah. But I was their main coach, and so I ushered it in.
For sure. Another one I wanted to talk to you about, just because like I wasn't around then. I don't know what was going on. What was like the slap bump? Like when you were like starting a class, ending a class, about to start a roll, did you guys line up? Did you shake hands? Did you high five? Did you go 1, 2, 3 clap?
Until I had stripes on my black belt, I never remember lining up. I never remember slap bump. I don't remember that 1, 2, 3 clap thing. That was all stuff that came. I don't even know what years it came, but I definitely don't remember any of that in the early days. In the really early days, I don't even remember red swaths on black belts.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was all that stuff had not been worked out yet.
Yeah. We did a video on the history of jiu-jitsu belts, and we talk about that, like Ponter, the red part of it. And what we found out was like originally you had like a white bar, which was like what you use for competitors.
Yes.
And then you had like actually a blue one. And then you had like a red one. And like the blue one would be you came from this lineage. The red one was like, I'm a black belt who teaches.
Yes. That was what it kind of meant. And, you know, all of this stuff, again, going back to nomenclature and terminology and hierarchy, I think it's important if you want to get skilled at this to separate all that from the art of jiu-jitsu. All the cultural stuff, all the rituals. The only time it becomes important is the uniform that we wear is also going to alter the way in which you train. And back in the days where we didn't have a Brazilian cut the jiu-jitsu gi, but the judo gis, the sleeves were shorter and longer. And there wasn't spider guard because there wasn't a good way to grab it. And you wouldn't do the inverted sleeve grip. You would do a pistol grip because there was a bunch of material on the sleeve. And now with the modern cut gi, you can't get a pistol grip because it fits like skinny jeans Armani suit. And that altered it. There was a period of time in which lapels were so thick they were choke proof. And we were almost losing the art of the lapel choke and lapel game. But then we started weighing in, wearing the gi, and suddenly it became, fuck, I need a light gi so I can eat. And that's what ushered in the lightweight foam collar gi and the current standard in which we have now, which is different from the judo standard, right? And yes, so environment stronger than will.
Yeah. I'm curious what your opinion is. One thing I think that's happened is I think jiu-jitsu's had this explosion in popularity with more people signing up. They're seeing Gordon Ryan, they're seeing Nicholas Marigali, and they're seeing like these guys going into MMA like Bushasha, and they're getting really interested into jiu-jitsu. However, one of the things I'm wondering is it feels like maybe the new people coming into jiu-jitsu aren't necessarily getting the full backstory of jiu-jitsu, where it comes from. You know, they don't necessarily know, like there's a difference between sport jiu-jitsu and self-defense jiu-jitsu. They don't know these lineages. I wonder for yourself, do you think it's important for students today to know about the history of jiu-jitsu, to know about the origins, to know why things have developed the way they have?
I think it's important for this reason. Because when you don't know history, you're more likely to repeat the same mistakes of history. And that's for all history. And when you know wrong history, propaganda, you're going to go down rabbit holes and be deceived. Now, saying that as an amateur historian anthropologist, I really believe the more you dig, the more you realize you just don't know. But there really is no true history. What there is are different subgroups, different individuals, their experience, and then a conglomeration and an algorithm of that, which is what we call history. And the old line, history is written by the winners, is certainly true in this art. And I personally find a lot of that history, from my experience, my perspective, seems wrong. Frequently seems like that's not really what happened. What happened was this. But people get different opinions on how and what things happen. I mean, obviously now, as we're in this post-the-truth world, I think real, quote unquote, real history is ever more important. And maybe trying to understand the history of jiu-jitsu will open your mind to the history of the combat sports, to the history of martial arts, and maybe you'll be interested in other histories too, cultural, economic history, and all that, so we can have a more vibrant, educated populace participating in our democracy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, if you want to know jiu-jitsu, you got to learn about Brazil, you got to learn about Japan, which will lead to all these other rabbit holes.
Leads to all these cool things. And I mean, why not? It's, I mean, in my opinion, history's always been really, really interesting. I love learning about history. I'm a museum junkie. When I go off to wherever, whether it's Europe or Israel, like, yeah, where do you want to go? Out to the bar and club? Oh, take me to a museum. Art or history, it is what I want to do.
Okay, I've got one last question.
Okay.
When you start jiu-jitsu, you're in the garage, you're learning this exotic new self-defense combat martial art.
Yes.
Did you ever see it getting to where it is today, where we have, ADCC in Las Vegas, we've got Gordon Ryan, we've got Chrome Gracie and Ryan Hall in the UFC? Did you ever imagine jiu-jitsu ending up like this? I'm
going to say both yes and no. There was a period of time shortly after UFC, and whether it was Joe Moreira or Hickson or the Machados were starting to put on the competitions. And I'd been to Brazil and been on a mat at the Baja Gracie School where there's 40 black belts, and thinking they are going to move up here next year and open up a school on every corner. That took 15 years. I thought that phase would happen so much faster. I could not believe how long it took for them to fucking realize, wow, I can move to any town, USA, and be the biggest fish in the pond, or I could stay in Rio and be just one of a group of black belts. And so in some ways, yes. And I never thought it would be quite as big by the non-jiu-jitsu world. I didn't think non-grapplers would know what it was. That part I missed. It's kind of like that thing, like, I am not one who watches sports. I watch highlight reels. I watch clips of how guys got their knockout and armbar. My brain isn't oriented to who and the name and who did what. It's much more what the move was and how it was. So my brain is not oriented towards that kind of mindset, which gives to cultural popularity. Mm-hmm. So yes and no. But I am shocked at how jiu-jitsu is so mainstream that even people who don't grapple will use jiu-jitsu analogies in their speech.
Mm-hmm. Are you going to be at ADCC in the summer?
I might.
Maybe I'll see you there.
I have not made up my mind. Yeah, maybe I'll go. I mean, yeah, it's like the last thing I will say. So, you know, I'm 59. I was born in the 60s, grew up in the 70s, came of age in the 80s. I saw surfing when I was really young become a thing where people who surfed were poor and lived out of their cars. Now they're pros. Skateboarding was a crime, and it was a thing that now, you know, it's like I knew eventually the jiu-jitsu would end up a thing where people would make a lot of money doing it. But I knew that I was too early, that I missed that boat, that I had passed my window of adult division competition when it had started to be a thing where you could be a professional jiu-jitsu athlete.
The thing is, though, with yourself, you were a pioneer. You were making the pathway so that others could do that.
Yep, I hacked through the jungle and made you a pathway.
100%. All right, Chris, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I feel like I still have so many more questions and we could go on for hours, but I will let you go. Is there anything that you're promoting? Do you have any camps going on at Combat Base?
I'm so glad you asked. My brain, I'm such a dean. The Combat Base Reno camp, May 3rd, 4th, and 5th. May, right? May 3rd, 4th, and 5th, Reno, Nevada, at Momentum Martial Arts. Go to combatbase.com for all the information. Combatbase.com. It's going to be an awesome camp. I teach
seminars.
Merchant. Oh yeah. Here's my wife, who's much smarter at this than I am.
In my pajamas. Combatbase.com. We have merchandise. We have club memberships. We have video content. We have all kinds of stuff. And if you don't want to sign up for anything, at least sign up for our mailing list so that you can get emails and know like what's going on with us. Follow us on social media. Yeah, we got a lot going on and we're always loving to reach out to more people. So thanks for asking.
Yes. And in terms of jiu-jitsu organizations, I am the most freedom, you can do your own thing kind of group. I don't believe in the strict hierarchy that other men should be able to tell you what you can wear and not wear on a mat. Like all that weird fascist cult stuff about the art, I'm not into. And if you feel without a home, look me up.
So go to Reno, May 3rd, 4th, 5th, wear your tie-dye gi, train with Chris.
Wear your tie-dye gi, combatbase.com. I helped inspire Christian to begin the Globetrotter camps, which I should have done, but he did an excellent job. He's awesome at it.
And people can reach you on Instagram at Chris Haueter Art. And
or Chris Haueter 96.
Or 96. All right. I will add all of those links in the description below. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you. And yeah, if you can, maybe put those links earlier in because we're already at the phase where people have already turned the podcast off.
For sure. I will do that.
Thank you.